I have worked in medicine for over 15 years. I started in 1998 in the city, but quickly realized that it wasn't for me. Noise, bustle, an endless stream of the same type of problems. A year later, I moved to a village, then further and further into the taiga. By 2005, I was working in places where I could get there only by wazik, and even then, not always. In spring and fall, the roads were washed away so that I had to wait for weeks until they dried up. It was there, in a tiny Evenki village lost among cedars, that in 2008 I met a man who changed my life forever. The old shaman's name was Elias. Few people knew that in his youth he graduated from medical school, but he chose the path of his ancestors, becoming a shaman. At the same time, he never renounced scientific knowledge. Nature is the same, he said. It's just that you can look at it in different ways. I remember the first time I went to him for advice. In the village, cases of poisoning were becoming more frequent. People complained of weakness and headaches. All the tests that could be done in our conditions showed nothing. Elias listened to me and silently pulled out a thick notebook with a worn leather cover. "It's not mushrooms and berries that people poison themselves with," he said, showing me the notes, "but water from the creek. Every spring when the snow is actively melting, it washes away the old hunting camps upstream. Tin cans, gunpowder, diesel fuel, everything goes into the water." He was right. And not only that, each of his advice, each observation had a strong scientific basis. He just explained them in his own way, through the laws of the taiga and the ancient knowledge of his people. Gradually I began to visit him more and more often, to learn, to listen, and he seemed to be waiting only for that. "You're a good doctor," he told me, "but you don't feel the soul of the taiga, and you can't do without it here." All day long we wandered through the forest, and he taught me to read footprints, to distinguish the voices of birds, to find healing herbs. He explained how to determine the weather for the next few days by subtle signs, how to understand when a beast was sick and when it was just frightened. I did not notice how these lessons became the main business of my life. I did not stop treating people, but more and more often I caught myself thinking that I was more interested in the taiga than in medicine. And then, in December 2010, the thing I feared most happened. Elias became gravely ill. "My time has come," he told me a week before he died, "but I am calm. You will go on." And he handed me that very leather-bound notebook. His will was strange. "Go to a nature reserve, where the rocks sing. The places themselves will find you." I didn't understand the meaning of those words at the time, but soon it turned out that Elias had thought it all through. It turned out that he had been advising the management of the Central Siberian Reserve on local flora for many years. The director of the reserve himself tracked me down after his death. "We need gamekeepers who understand the taiga," he told me at the time. "Elias told me about you. Said you could read tracks as well as the local hunters, knew the habits of the animals, and most importantly, you have a sense of the forest. Such people are rare, especially those with a medical degree. Of course, I had to undergo training, pass exams, and get all the necessary documents. In February 2011, I went on my first duty, and only now, after 5 years of work in the reserve, I begin to realize that even then the old shaman knew how my fate would turn out. By the spring of 2016, I was almost accustomed to my new life. 5 years on the reserve was no small amount of time. The old gamekeeper, Harrison Blake, no longer called me doctor, and the locals had long since recognized me as one of their own. The work was not easy, but it was exactly what I wanted. Just you, the taiga, and its inhabitants. The camera trap system helped me to monitor the territory, and I was just about to prepare my quarterly report when I noticed the first oddities. The first camera trap started malfunctioning in early March. Usually the camera captured everything: moose at the watering hole, bears after hibernation, even Eurasian eagles fidgeting on the trail. But since March 3rd, strange images began to appear. Empty, as if someone had turned the lens sideways. At first I thought it was the wind or a curious bear, but the camera was intact and the mounts were not damaged. I checked the memory card. Several hours of footage were missing, as if someone had erased them on purpose. A week later, the same thing happened to the second camera, 3 kilometers away from the first, then the third. I began to look more closely at the installation sites. On the damp spring ground near the second camera, I noticed barely recognizable footprints. Human footprints. Not hunting boots, not rubber stockings of locals, but something like modern trekking boots. The size is small, obviously city shoes. What is remarkable, the footprints were only in the dead zone of the camera, where the lens did not reach. By the middle of March, 6 cameras in my sector periodically went blind. I took out the map, laid out all the photos on the table, including the empty frames. The dates. Something in them was alarming. I opened the trap inspection log and realized the cameras were out of order 2 or 3 days before the scheduled inspection and came to life a day after my visit. Someone knew the schedule. I wasted the night, and in the morning I went to the cameras again. Now I knew what to look for. At each of them I examined not only the mounts, but also the nearest trees. On 3 of them I found barely noticeable scratches in the bark at a man's height. Somebody was marking blind spots? I made a few circles around each cell, looking at the ground. Moss was disturbed here. Last year's grass was crumpled there. I drew the sectors of view of all the cameras on the map, marked the traces I'd noticed. Gradually a corridor appeared. Narrow, maybe 5 meters, but enough to hide anything from the eyes of the reserve. At home, I mapped the camera trigger times. They were going off in the same sequence, a few hours apart. It was as if someone was moving along this corridor, systematically blinding the cameras along the way, and then after a day or 2 would come back, restoring their position. It was time to act. I bought 3 new cameras in the city, compact, with a wider angle of view. I camouflaged them more carefully than usual, not on the trunks, but in the dense crowns of young spruce trees. I did not choose the points at random. If my intended route was correct, they had to capture areas where the intruders were not waiting for observation. The calculation turned out to be correct. Later, looking through the pictures, I froze. One of the shots, taken in the pre-dawn twilight, clearly showed a group of people. 3 of them, each carrying a bulky backpack behind their backs. They were following the trail, ducking down, obviously knowing where the camera traps were located. The equipment was semi-professional, unloading vests, light Gore-Tex jackets, the very same trekking boots. The next day I followed their tracks. The trail was almost unreadable. They walked carefully, trail to trail, on the hardest parts of the soil. But I did find something. A couple of kilometers away from the camera, in the dense undergrowth, I found their camping place. No campfire, no obvious traces of a camp, only crumpled moss and barely visible footprints. But they had left something behind. A scrap of satellite phone packaging and an empty bag of special mountain food. These are used by industrial climbers and professional rescuers. For ordinary poachers, it's too expensive and too professional. He climbed a small hill and looked around. From here their route was clearer. They were going to an old winter hut on the bank of the Podkamenia Tunguska. The place is remote. Tourists do not wander there. Local hunters also avoid it. It is too far from the lands. It was an ideal place for a staging post. In the middle of April, I sent a detailed report to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. A week later, I was summoned to Krasnoyarsk. In the office of an investigator from the drug control, I saw my photos, arranged by date. "You've done a great job, James Harris," the major said, handing me a folder of documents. The photos showed more than just footprints, a whole system. Hiding places, temporary camps, a camouflage boat landing. The criminals were using the reserve as a staging area for drug trafficking. The operation was carried out in late April, but not in the reserve. They took them on their way out, at the pier in a small village. They say they seized more than 100 kilograms of synthetic drugs. In the reserve, they found 2 hiding places and the remains of a camp. And after another month, I learned that one of the reserve's employees had resigned of his own accord and left for an unknown destination. Apparently, the one who knew the schedule of camera trap checks. Later, while looking through Elias's old notebook, I came across a strange entry. "Shadows come and go, but the taiga remembers everything," he wrote. "When you hear the voice of the stones, you know it's time." At the time, these words seemed to me another riddle of the old shaman. I didn't know that very soon they would take on a completely different meaning, and that some of the secrets of the reserve would turn out to be much more surprising than the stories of poachers and drug dealers. The end of May 2016 was surprisingly hot. The snow in the taiga had melted earlier than usual, exposing rocky ledges on the coastal slopes. Harrison Blake, an old gamekeeper, dropped by for his regular rounds on just such a day. The sun was scorching the gray rocks so hot that it was impossible to touch them. The conversation over tea began as usual, with news of the site, traces of spring flooding, and the first bear marks on the trees. When I asked about the stone pillars in the eastern sector, Harrison reacted with his usual skepticism. He'd worked at the preserve for 30 years and had seen a lot of unexplained things that were then explained by the most common reasons. Glowing rots, strange footprints in the snow, mysterious sounds, all these had simple explanations. But when I told him about the singing coming from the rocks, he somehow became serious. It turned out that he himself had been hearing these sounds for 3 weeks now. Long, moaning sounds, like a quiet melody, especially in the morning, when the river was cold. He wrote it off to age, to fatigue, to the wind in the crevices. I even tried to find a decoy or a metal can that could resonate, but all to no avail. I pulled out Elias's notebook. Harrison grimaced. He didn't like all that shamanic stuff. But when I showed him the notes describing the sounds and sketches of the rocks, his disbelief was replaced by interest. The shaman wrote about this phenomenon in detail. When spring comes earlier than usual, the rocks begin to sing. Not every year, and not on any day, only when the sun was in a certain position. The notes even included diagrams of the rocks' locations and notes on wind direction. The next morning we set off for the rocks, equipped as for a real expedition. Thermometer, compass, anemometer to measure wind strength, map with Elias's notes, notebook. Harrison Blake grumbled all the way about waking up too early, but he didn't argue. The notebook clearly indicated the time of the sounds. The stone pillars greeted us with majestic silence. 15 or 20 meters high, they stood in a dense group, reminiscent of petrified forest or ancient columns. While I checked my notes in my notebook, Harrison did what he did best: methodical examination. Tapping the stones, measuring the distances between them, checking the direction of cracks. The first sound came as the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon. A long, vibrating sound. It seemed to originate deep within the stone and rise upward. Harrison was just examining one of the crevices and almost dropped his flashlight in surprise. But at once he pulled himself together and began to examine the place from which the sound seemed to be coming. It was his meticulousness that made the first discovery. In the place where the sound was most distinct, the rock was riddled with small holes like beehives, some almost imperceptible, others the size of a pencil. They went deep into the rock at different angles, and we also noticed that the intensity of the sound changed with each gust of wind from the river. By mid-June, we had made a detailed map of all the channels and voids. On paper, it looked like a tangled system of pipes. Somewhere they came to the surface, somewhere they connected inside the rock, forming a kind of resonators. Elias found similar diagrams in his notebook. He compared these rocks to a giant flute and even noted which holes produced the strongest sound. Temperature observations finally clarified the picture. We set up several thermometers at different heights and noticed a clear pattern. During the day, the sun heated the dark surface of the rocks up to 40 degrees, and at night the temperature dropped to almost zero. Because of this difference, powerful air currents arose inside the rock. Passing through a system of natural channels, they created these mysterious sounds, and when the wind blew from the river at a certain angle, the effect was amplified many times over. What Elias poetically called rock breathing turned out to be a complex but understandable natural phenomenon. Harrison even had the idea of writing an article about it in a scientific journal. I kept coming back to the other entries in the shaman's notebook. Even the most cryptic of them seemed to conceal real natural phenomena. In early July, the heat subsided and the stone pillars quieted, but one of Elias's last notes kept me on my toes. When the stones are silent, listen to the beast. He knows what men have forgotten. I didn't realize then that those words would be the key to unlocking a far more disturbing mystery. The first warning signs came in mid-July 2016. Moose, usually feeding in floodplain meadows near the river, suddenly changed their route. Roe deer were also avoiding their favorite places. Even wild boars, which are rarely frightened by anything, left the rich berry fields in the lowlands. It was as if the animals were avoiding some invisible boundary. Harrison Blake was the first to spot bear tracks. Large, deeply embedded in the soft soil, they stretched along the old sagebrush. But there was something unusual about them. The animal was limping. The right hind paw left a deeper mark, as if the bear had shifted most of its weight to it. Old hunters say that an injured bear is the most dangerous animal in the taiga, especially if the injury prevents it from getting its usual food. A week later, a huntsman from a neighboring property reported a ruined apiary. Usually bears simply overturn the hives, but this one acted differently. Methodically, almost carefully removed the covers, as if he knew their structure. The beekeeper noticed the beast from afar. A large male, with sagebrush in his hair, was noticeably falling down on his hind leg. But the main thing was that he didn't run away when the man started shouting and banging on the metal barrel. Just looked in his direction and went on about his business. By early August, the situation had escalated. A group of geologists were working in the reserve, and they were camped near the creek. During the night, a bear came to them right into the parking lot. Ignoring shouts and flares, it methodically destroyed the tent with supplies. One of the geologists tried to drive the beast away and got a strong blow with his paw. Fortunately, he managed to bounce away and got off with deep scratches on his shoulder. In the morning, I examined the scene. The tracks told me a lot. The bear had approached the camp not from the forest, but along the stream bed, where it was harder to spot. The hind paw prints were even deeper. The injury had clearly progressed. In some places there was hair on the crumpled grass, gray in some places, in others with a yellowish tinge, typical of sick animals. Other traces were also found. Along the creek, on the wet clay, there were animal footprints, those of roe deer, wild boars, elk. All of them had avoided the place, as if they sensed danger. In Elias's notebook, I found a note about it. A healthy bear is part of the taiga. A sick one is a thorn in the side. All living things smell it and avoid it. By mid-August, the bear began to appear to people more and more often. Near tourist camps, near forest huts, even on the outskirts of the nearest village. He did not attack, but did not leave when people tried to scare him away. There was a kind of doomed persistence in his behavior, as if he knew that cold weather was coming soon, and with such an injury, he would not survive the winter. For a long time I did not dare to open certain pages in the shaman's notebook, but one evening, after another report of a bear, I did find them. A limping death comes for a reason, Elias wrote. If the beast seeks human contact, it's tired. Such must be helped to leave. In the 20th of August, a special commission came to us. While biologists and veterinarians examined the tracks and collected data, I reread the notes in the shaman's notebook. Elias had left detailed descriptions of similar cases. Traumatized bears that could not feed themselves often came out to people. Not out of aggression, out of desperation. The commission met for 3 days. I listened to the reports of experts, looked at photos of tracks, studied the animal's movement patterns. The injury was serious. Torn ligaments, inflammation, possibly even bone infection. Every day the bear was losing strength. He couldn't hunt, he couldn't walk far. It was 2 months away from hibernation, but with a wound like that, he simply wouldn't have accumulated enough fat. Inside me, the doctor and the gamekeeper struggled. The doctor was looking for ways to help, going over treatment options. But the gamekeeper understood. There are no hospitals in the wilderness. Trying to catch and treat a wounded adult bear would only prolong the agony. Plus, it was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Next time, someone could get seriously hurt. Harrison, who had known the bear for many years, felt badly about what was happening. But even he realized the beast was no longer the same. The dangerous determination of a cornered predator in his eyes. "Better this way than to suffer," he said one evening, and I realized the decision had been made. It wasn't an easy decision. Harrison, who had known the bear for years, insisted on shooting it. "Better that than to suffer," he said. I kept thinking about what Elias had said. Maybe the old shaman really did know something. Maybe that's why he'd left that note, so that when the time came, I'd know what to do. In the last days of August, the bear was tracked down and shot. It was a clean, professional job. The animal was not in pain. Upon examination of the carcass, veterinarians confirmed the initial diagnosis: serious trauma to the hind leg, old, with extensive inflammation. Such wounds do not heal on their own. Later, I asked the old hunter if he'd seen many cases like this. "Stuff happens," he replied. "But for a bear to come out so close to people, unafraid of noise and fire, that's a special case. Usually they avoid humans to the last. This one seemed to know it couldn't do it alone." That fall, moose and roe deer returned to the reserve. Boars grunted in the berry patches again. Birds sang as before. The taiga gradually returned to its normal rhythm. But I thought about what had happened for a long time. There were still many unread pages in Elias's notebook. "Time will come," he wrote, "and you will realize that nothing in the taiga is accidental. Every encounter is a sign. You just have to know how to read them." The fall of 2016 was unusually quiet. After the bear story, it was as if something had changed in the sanctuary. Even Harrison's perpetual scowl had noticed that the animals were calmer, more confident. I went back to Elias's notebook more and more often, rereading the notes that had seemed to be just beautiful phrases from the shaman. In early October, as I parsed through the old notes, I began to notice a strange pattern. All of this year's events, the story with the drug dealers, the singing stones, the bear, each had been predicted in one way or another in the notebook. "Shadows will come in secret paths," he wrote of the first one. "Stones will speak before their time," about the second. "A limping death will disturb the peace," about the third. But it wasn't about the predictions. Elias left me not prophecies, but a guide to action. Each entry contained not only a description of events, but also hints on how to deal with them. In the story of the drug dealers, his description of the ancient trails helped. In the case of the singing stones, notes on winds and temperatures. And with the bear, an understanding of when nature needs help to finish what it started. One evening I found a quadruple folded piece of paper in my notebook. On it was drawn in faded ink a map of the reserve, rough, schematic, but with surprisingly accurate notes. ancient trails, places of power, special signs of the area, and most importantly, dates. Opposite each important place were certain days and months when something was going to happen there. I checked the dates. It all fit. The drug dealers had appeared exactly when, according to Elias's notes, the ancient paths had opened to outsiders. The stones began to sing on days marked on the map with a special sign. Even the bear story happened at the predicted time, when the taiga releases the sick. In mid-October, I climbed to one of the observation platforms, a place where, in Elias's words, you can see the whole truth all at once. Below was the preserve, the dark green of cedars, the yellow patches of larches, the gray cliffs by the river. It was business as usual, but now I saw it differently. Every trail, every hollow, every stream, everything had its own meaning, its own history, its own role. There, at the height, I finally realized what the old shaman was trying to tell me. He didn't predict the future, he read the present. He knew that at certain times of the year the ancient paths become more visible and attract attention. That under special weather conditions, porous rocks begin to resonate. That wounded animals reach out to humans in the fall. All of his mysticism was based on a deep understanding of nature. In the last days of October, I found another record, the shortest. When you understand the language of the taiga, it will open its secrets to you. But remember, every clue brings a new mystery. On the next page, I could see some notes about thunderstorms and glowing rocks. I smiled. It looked like Elias had many more stories in store for me, and now I was ready for them. That evening, Harrison called. The local hunters had seen something unusual in a remote creek, the same creek that had been marked on Elias's map. Something that made even the most seasoned taiga hunters avoid the place. I pulled out my notebook, found the page I was looking for. When autumn meets winter, an ancient fire awakens in the hollows. I read the familiar handwriting. It looked like a new story had already begun. The winter of 2016 has covered the reserve with a fluffy blanket of snow. I am sitting in my hut. The stove is stoked. The wood is crackling. On the table, a worn leather notebook, a map with cryptic notes and my own diary, where I now record my observations. I've learned a lot about the reserve, about its mysteries, about myself. Elias was right. The taiga does talk to those who are ready to listen to it, not with mystical signs or mysterious omens, but in the language of traces and omens, weather and animal habits, ancient paths and stone songs. You just have to learn to understand this language. Sometimes Harrison comes to see me. We drink tea, talk about the reserve's business. He no longer frowns when I take out the shaman's notebook. On the contrary, he asks to see some records. Many of the old man's observations are very accurate. Science is science, he says now, but centuries of experience are worth something too. Yesterday, the first serious snow fell. I went out on my rounds and suddenly caught myself thinking that I can't imagine any other life. Here at the preserve, every day brings something new. Every trail can lead to a discovery. Every trail can tell a story. And Elias's notebook still holds many mysteries. But I know now that the clues will come in their own time. The main thing is to be attentive and remember that nothing in the taiga is accidental. Everything has its time, its meaning, its place. What do you think? What was it really? Just coincidences? Or is there really something more behind it all? Maybe there is knowledge that modern science can't explain yet. And the story of the bear, a lot of people think it could have been saved, that the gamekeepers took the easiest way out. But what do you think? Did they have the moral right to decide its fate? And in general, should a man interfere with the laws of nature, even if he is guided by good intentions? You know, They say that every nature reserve has its inexplicable stories. Have you ever come across something that defies logical explanation? Tell us in the comments. Let's discuss it together. If you like this story, do not forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. There are many more interesting taiga stories to come, and some of them may turn out to be much more mysterious. See you in the harsh and beautiful taiga.